This is a video I made of the installation of a transmission into a 1995 Mercedes Benz E320, the W124. Original transmission started to die around 226,000 miles, lost reverse first, which is kind of pretty classic with these cars. The rebuilt transmission is from Sun Valley Mercedes out of California, great shop. I've taken a different approach. I've made a video essentially that I would want to see, which is not really spending a lot of time of someone doing the actual work and twisting wrenches and stuff like that. It's more kind of a montage of stages of the install and the kind of video I would look for when I was preparing for doing a light job. It doesn't show the removal of the transmission because the camera only arrived halfway through the job. So there you have it. You can probably find a fairly decent, well, you can find decent websites that show you how to do that piece. It's not really for neophytes, but maybe it'll work. I guess the only other thing about it is that apologies in advance for me saying a lot and make a note of this and other things that I tend to repeat myself about now that I'm an old fart. So hopefully this is useful. I think I would find it useful, so let's see if others do. Thanks.
Okay, I'm gonna swap out the crankshaft position sensor. You can see it there right below the oil pressure switch. This is a good time to do this because it's considerably more accessible than with the transmission on. As you can see, the electrical connection is sort of like a spark plug boot, pulls off fairly easily by hand. Remove the securing bolt with a 5mm Allen wrench. So here is the new Mercedes Benz crankshaft position sensor alongside the old one and the Allen key. We now have a spare crankshaft position sensor in the box for emergency use later. New crankshaft position sensor in place. That little boot that fits on top fits on there pretty snugly. You have to make sure that you have it fully seated. Give it a little bit of pressure. This is the bracket for the Bowden cable that I'm gonna transfer to the new transmission. Just want to say that this bracket is worthy of Project Binky. I can just imagine the Mercedes engineers who came up with this. Just a quick note here. This kick-down cable device, it's I think it's called variable actuator. It's for the cool running transmission. Has two inputs to it. The original one only has one, as you can see here. It just has the green input. What the Sun Valley Mercedes and others have said is simply when they updated this particular device, the actuator, they added in a feature. You just cap it, don't use it. Here you can see the rather funky, sorry about the shadow here, neutral safety switch, which I am going to replace on the new transmission with a new one, but I need that shift actuator. Removing the shift actuator using two 10mm wrenches. The actuator lever now off. Neutral safety switch is held on by two 10mm bolts here and here. They are quite tight. I don't envy people who have to do this job in situ. Just a quick note that there is some adjustment on this that you can see there. In my case, it was in this position. just a quick look with the neutral safety switch removed. Here's the new neutral safety switch and the shift lever and the 2 bolts that I recovered from the original slush box. This is the NSS in place. In my case, I'm rotating it essentially as clockwise as I can because that was what it looked like on the original machine. Here is the neutral safety switch actually all put in and adjusted. One thing I'll say with this is I would have not tightened these 2 bolts until you've lined up the shift actuator. It seemed to be the best way. Otherwise you're going to constantly keep needing to readjust this piece of it. Okay, so the tranny is ready to be mated up with the engine at this point. Like I said previously, rear main seal was done. I reused the flex plate flywheel bolts by measuring them. They were in Mercedes spec and have reinstalled. Tranny is all ready to go. I have lowered the lift down a little bit so it can so it makes me stoop a little bit, but I won't have the transmission be quite as unstable on the Harbor Freight jack here. Okay, our transmission's fairly close to being mated up. In my case, it was helpful to lift the engine to angle it back just a little bit, and with a combination of that and the tilt feature on the jack is pretty closer. I'd like to get it a little bit closer. Just a quick note here, I have essentially a guide bolt in here at about 3 o'clock, another one on the other side, the lower starter motor bolt. What I'm kind of doing is very gradually cinching these down, so I don't want to crush anything, and I am moving the back of the transmission, the jack, as I tighten them down, just so that everything is guided in place. It's going in pretty easy though. So there's the bolt in at 3. Going over here, bottom starter motor bolt is in, everything seems pretty lined up. What I'm going to do here next is just turn the engine over and make sure that that the torque converter and flex plate aren't binding in any way. You can kind of see here that, if I get the lights right, that I can rotate the torque converter and it's not interfering at all with the flex plate, so I feel pretty confident I can move on to tightening in the other bell housing bolts. Here, of the, I think 10 bell housing bolts, including the starter motor bolts, 2 of them are a little bit longer than the others. Here's the starter motor bolt, which is considerably longer, but most of the bolts are M1045, and 2 of them are M1050. When I took them out, I didn't really pay attention to that, so I am going to make educated guess as to where to put them back. So all the bolts are in loosely. Everything seems nicely lined up. One tip on this green vacuum line to the cold start actuator shifter. As you're bringing the transmission up, it'll probably be easier to connect that when you get it close, but you have a little more access. You can just about get enough room to connect it, but it would be a lot easier on the way in. There are 2 slightly longer by 5mm bolts. I was having a hard time figuring out where they went. Once you're in situ here, You can kind of see that it's these two bottom bolts that connect the alloy part of the oil pan to the bottom of the bell housing. It's just a little bit longer, and it can take advantage of the entire thread. If you put one of the short bolts in here, it won't do that. Getting ready to torque down the transmission to block bolts, and this is my kit for it. What we've got here is about a 6-inch wobble extension, 3/8, very long extension, also 3/8, and a taped up universal joint. So under the tape, you know, universal. Okay. So this gives you an idea. Kind of, you can maneuver it with your right hand here up at the front, and turn with your left hand. Once you get it tighter, you can get back there and tighten it down. Here's a quick shot of me at one of the top volts on the left side, and I'll be doing the same thing for the one directly below it. By the way, this is 55 Newton meters. 55 Newton meters equals 40.56 foot-pounds. Just a quick check-in here. While the transmission is hanging down, it's a good idea to hook up all these various pieces, like the neutral safety switch and other bits and bobs, which I have done. It's just, you didn't catch me doing it. As you can see, they're all fairly tight in there, and it's a lot easier to get those things done and hooked up when you have a little bit more accessibility to it. We've started here, and in the next segment we'll start to look at this flex disc here, which I've got started ready to install. Just a quick shout out to the guys at Mercedes Source, designed this little kit. Up in there you can see the shift linkage, and you can see the brand new bushing that I put in there, but also there's that spring clip on the end. If you look at the back where it connects to the shifter from inside the car, it's a little bit better of a view. You can see right there is the bushing, then the shift linkage, and the little clip on the end that holds it together. So the tool from Mercedes Source allows you to open the end of the clip, and they throw it in with this. It's not cheap, but with 4 Mercedes, I figured I could make use of it. So now we're at the point of bolting up the flex plate to the torque converter. I've added the first 2 bolts. In order to be able to do that, you should be able to turn the torque converter with your finger, and it should rotate that easily to get the first 2 bolts lined up. Once you've done that, you're going to have to rotate the engine, obviously, and that is done from the front in a clockwise position. It is an 1 1/16" socket, whatever that translates into millimeter wise, and it needs to be done clockwise. So what I'm going to do here is essentially insert all of the flex plate bolts. Next up is the flex disc, or as Mercedes call it, I guess, the companion disc. Still have the transmission somewhat lower to make it accessible. The key thing to bear in mind with this one is get things set up so you can rotate it. Yeah, make sure you're not in gear or whatever, handbrake on. And the other is that where there are washers, they need to be on the flex. So say here, where there's just a bolt head on the yoke of the drive shaft, there's no washer. Whereas here, where it's just the washer inside the disc, you need to have a washer. So regardless of whether it's a head or a bolt, you kind of see on the inside, hopefully, there, that you need a washer where there isn't a yoke. Just a footnote here, the bolts here, from what I can tell, need to be tightened to 16 Newton meters. And one of the things that's kind of a hassle about doing all of this is that you need to undo this end of the drive shaft to get the clearance, to get the shaft in there, in fact to even get the transmission in there. So when I tighten that up, I'll kind of show you how that works. Next step is to deal with the transmission mount. I'm putting this on after the flex disc. It's a little bit of a pain. You know, I have a lot of room here to tighten it up. And also, you're going to have to figure out a way of integrating it with the cross member. So what I'm going to do is essentially hang the cross member, bolt the cross member in here, and then mate it up to here, and then tighten everything down. So just a quick update here. Sorry about the radio in the background, but what I did was torque down these bolts here to 45 Newton meters, and now I'm going to tighten up all the other nuts and bolts that hold the engine mount or the transmission mount to the transmission. Just seems like that's the most convenient way to do it, and it's also kind of easier to line up the cross member to where it was originally. This is the prop shaft securing nut, which needs to be tightened to 30 to 40 Newton meters. I'm going to do it with a pair of pliers, essentially. Exhaust heat shield installed. 3 screws stroke bolts, one here, and one here. So moving on to the transmission cooler lines. This is the driver's side line already installed. Key pieces here are replace those aluminum washers on the bolt itself. Spec from Mercedes is 20 Newton meters plus 90 degrees in terms of tightness. And the only other thing I would say is just be super careful to make sure you're getting the thread lined up when installing. Last thing you want to do is cross thread your thread into the tranny. So the automatic transmission dipstick tube is kind of a pain. It fits in here. There's an O-ring that goes there. But there is a place where it bolts onto a bell housing up there. And then way up off the head, there is a place where it bolts onto the side of the head. So, tricky to get in and out. Quick view of the bottom of the dipstick tube with a new O-ring ready to be cinched down, and the receptacle in the transmission. Now I'm going to have to get up there and get that bolt and finish off tightening it to the bell housing. You can kind of see from this angle where the dipstick tube connects up to the head there. There is an Allen bolt that connects it in there, and that's what we're going to do next. Is very low clearance. This is my workaround for getting this bolt out, and I'm going to use the same system for getting it back in. So it's this is 6mm Allen. Yeah, 6mm is the size of the Allen key. It's a 6mm hex wrench that fits this Allen key, and I've got a tiny 6mm open wrench, which will become obvious in a minute. So as you can see, very little clearance down in here, and that's why I'm using the 6mm socket here. Like, it gives me just enough room to tighten the bolt up, and once I get it little bit further in there, I'll use the little wrench to complete the job. So I'm starting to get this kind of all cinched down. I've started the bolt up at on the bell housing there. This one here is still loose, and the one at the very top there is also kind of loose. So first I'm going to make sure that the O-ring here gets cinched down properly, and then I'll retorque the bell housing bolt there. So just buttoning up the transmission filler pipe. As you can see, there's my Rube Goldberg tiny wrench and 6mm socket. That's what I use to tighten it up. I'm sure there's a Mercedes engineer somewhere who is feeling kind of fiendish about that. So I've spared everybody the pain of seeing this exhaust installed. It is just really difficult to do. It's one of those places where on a lift it may actually be a little bit easier. I ended up, to get it, I had the car kind of almost on the ground. Hangers back here. There's a hanger just here. Hanger right here. The two spring hangers off the back of the transmission. These two bolts here, and all culminating in the front and left manifolds here. But as you can see, it's kind of like you can't really get a decent angle on it. To get the front part of the exhaust up in there, you've really got to just get the angle kind of perfect. It's almost perfect when it's, like I said, flat on the floor. Just hooking up the Bowden cable. It's pretty straightforward. Looks like any other kind of, accelerator style cable. You push it through the square bracket at the top there and connect it to a ball. Very straightforward. So the transmission is in. I just took it for its first test drive and it is operating flawlessly. I inserted 7 quarts of transmission fluid. I presume there was some residual in there, and it's about right for a hot transmission.
So there you have it. Transmission is in. It's very drivable. It shifts really, really well. Sun Valley use a dyno, I think, before they ship the transmissions out. So the settings all were just perfect, and the car runs really, really well. I did take the opportunity to replace a few other things along the way, like the prop shaft or drive shaft flex disc. I did the rear main seal and a couple other things. But it's not the worst job in the world. Obviously having a lift helps, but I really enjoyed the job, and hopefully again this video will be useful to people.